Letter 1. To Mrs. Saville, England. St. Petersburg, December 11th, 17 blank. You will rejoice to hear that no disaster has accompanied the commencement of an enterprise that you have regarded with such evil forebodings. Hello, and welcome to Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein. I'm Sophie Marie, and this is a show where I'm attempting to watch every single film adaptation of my favorite novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Before we start, I want to give a few content warnings. This episode will talk about death, specifically suicide, murder, execution, all of that, potentially bodily mutilation, various body horror, and this episode for sure will talk about sex. I want to give a shout out to the podcast Jane Ostentations, where I stole this concept from. Go check them out. It is hosted by Sasha Sienna and Jessica Law. They're great. This week, for the very first episode, I want to talk about the 1994 Kenneth Branagh directed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm going to start by reading the relatively lengthy but well worth it Wikipedia synopsis of the plot. Here we go. In 1794, Captain Walton leads a troubled expedition to reach the North Pole. While their ship is trapped in the ice of the Arctic Sea, the crew hears a frightening noise and witnesses dogs being viciously killed. The crew discovers a man, Victor Frankenstein, traveling across the Arctic on his own. Victor proceeds to tell Walton and the crew his life story, which is presented as a flashback. Victor grows up in Geneva with his adopted sister, Elizabeth, who will become later the love of his life and wife. Before he leaves for the University of Ingolstadt, Victor's mother dies, giving birth to his brother, William. Traumatized by the grief, Victor vows on his mother's grave that he will find a way to conquer death. However, he is shunned by his peers, who view him as a madman. What they forget to mention is that he has zero understanding of medical science. Eventually, Victor and his friend, Henry Clerval, meet Shmael Augustus Waldman, a professor whose notes contain information on how to create life. Waldman warns Victor not to use these notes, lest he create an abomination. While performing vaccinations, Dr. Waldman is murdered by a stubborn patient who is later hanged in the village square. Using the body of the convicted felon, a leg from a fellow student named Schiller, who died from cholera, and Waldman's brain, Victor builds a creature based on the professor's notes. He is so obsessed with his work that he drives Elizabeth away when she comes to take him away as Ingolstadt is being put into quarantine. Victor finally gives his creation life, but soon regrets his decision and tries to kill it with an axe. The creature steals his coat and is driven away by the townspeople when it tries to steal food. The creature escapes the town, running off into the wilderness. He spends months living in a family's barn without their knowledge, gradually learning to read and speak based on observations of the family and memories from Waldman's brain. He attempts to earn the family's trust by anonymously helping them with their failing farm, and eventually converses with the patriarch, an elderly blind man, after murdering an abusive debt collector. However, when the blind man's family returns, they attack the creature and abandon their home. The creature finds Victor's journal in his coat and learns of the circumstances of his creation. He burns down the farm and vows revenge on his creator. Victor, who believes the creature to be dead from the cholera epidemic, returns to Geneva to marry Elizabeth. He finds his younger brother William has been murdered. Justine, a servant of the Frankenstein household, is inadvertently framed by the creature and hanged by a mob before anyone can prove her innocence. The creature later then abducts Victor and demands that he make a companion for him, promising to leave his creator in peace if he does. Victor begins gathering the tools he used to create life, but when the creature insists that he use Justine's body to make the companion, Victor breaks his promise, and the creature exacts his revenge by strangling Victor's father and later tearing out Elizabeth's heart. Maddened with grief beyond measure, Victor races home to bring Elizabeth back to life. There he finds Henry, who tells him he should let Elizabeth rest in peace. Instead, Victor stitches Elizabeth's head onto Justine's fully intact body, and she reawakes as a reanimated creature. The two are briefly and happily reunited until the creature appears, demanding Elizabeth as his bride. Victor and the creature fight for Elizabeth's affections, but Elizabeth, horrified by what she has become, commits suicide by setting herself on fire. Both Victor and the creature escape as the mansion burns down. The story then returns to the Arctic. Victor tells Walton that he has been pursuing his creation for months to kill him. Soon after relating his story, Victor dies from pneumonia. Walton discovers the creature weeping over Victor's body, confessing that for all his hatred, he still considers Victor to be his father. The crew prepares a funeral pyre, but the ceremony is interrupted when the ice around the ship cracks. Walton invites the creature to stay with the ship, but the creature insists on remaining with the pyre. He takes the torch and burns himself alive with Victor's body. Walton, having seen the consequences of Victor's obsession, orders the ship to return home. So, just to start, before we move on, Victor Frankenstein is played by Kenneth Branagh. Elizabeth is played by Helena Bonham Carter. The monster is played by Robert De Niro. And the ill-fated Dr. Waldman is played by John Cleese. Also, this was executive produced by Francis Ford Coppola, who earlier, I can't remember if it was exactly that year or the year later, would direct Bram Stoker's Dracula. These were meant to be sort of companion pieces. I'm going to start out with my personal feelings on this film. I think it's bad. Not only do I think that it's not a great movie, it's a fine watch. While I think it is closest to the plot of the original novel, I think it completely misses the point. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail later, but I just wanted to preface this. You can take whatever I say with a grain of salt, knowing that I do not like this film. To start with, the way the film is constructed is pretty messy. The score is very melodramatic. It's not a bad score. It's just over the top and doesn't actually serve... It tends to try to make scenes that don't need to be melodramatic. I find the editing to be fine. There's one scene in particular that's pretty egregious, and that is actually the scene after the monster has been reanimated. He spills out of this metal entrapment that Victor has put him in, filled with amniotic fluid, and it is just naked Robert De Niro, but flopping around, and there's these jagged, awkward cuts that to me looks like a YouTube video, like the kinds that you would see that are not vines, but they're making fun of source material. It's a mess. Now, going actually to the plot. For the most part, like I mentioned earlier, this is a relatively faithful plot adaptation to the original novel. There are a few big departures, which is where I think the film goes wrong the most. The first one that really, really bothers me, there are some before this that don't bother me as much. The first one is Justine's death. So Justine is the family nursemaid to Victor's younger brother, William, who is murdered by the monster. In the novel, Victor knows, or at least suspects, that the monster has killed his brother. And Justine actually goes on trial, and there is a back and forth in Victor's mind about whether or not he should reach out and confess that it is his monster. He decides not to. Justine is convicted and executed. That, to me, shows where Victor's character truly lies. It's in self-preservation. He is inherently a selfish character. He is a character that only thinks about his own direct needs or direct desires. Whereas in the film, they make the whole scene where Justine dies is this violent mob for some reason is angry about the death of a noble child, which to me doesn't make much sense, but okay. They come, they kidnap her, and they hang her in the public square. There's nothing Victor can do, even if he wanted to. Thus, in my opinion, absolving him of this crime. Not that he killed his brother, but absolving him of any guilt having created the monster that killed his brother, or the emotional crime of letting an innocent woman die. I think that's a big issue with this film. Secondly, this isn't a plot adaptation issue, but I do think the accents are hilarious. Majority of this is based in Geneva. Part of it is based in Germany. Every single character has a British accent, except for the monster, who is inexplicably from Brooklyn. I do think that specifically Helena Bonham Carter and Robert De Niro are acting their butts off, but it's in service of a movie that's not very good. So kind of coming back to the actual plot, there is something really important. Actually, it's not as important because it doesn't affect the direct plot of the film very much, but Henry dies in the book, and it's and when I read it the first time, his death meant more to me than I think anyone else's. And I think that's because he's the only character who gets a true glimpse into Victor's mind and into Victor's sort of, I don't want to say madness, because I think that he makes these decisions with a clear goal. He's not crazy, but he is prideful and not very smart. I also think, actually, returning to the beginning of the film, in the film, they really hammer home that Victor is obsessed with the philosophy of life and death, and his colleagues at the university just think that he's crazy, but this professor understands his genius. And it's not shown that he is disregarding medical science as much as I think it should. It definitely glorifies the way that he thinks of his own research and his own goals, which, yes, later that is demonized when he creates the monster and he immediately flees from it. I think that scene is actually pretty good, because in the book, he's just horrified. The monster is ugly. It doesn't feel truly human. He feels like he's committed some kind of sin. And in the film, I think Kenneth Branagh does project that pretty well. Maybe not in so many words. My next sort of adaptation issue with this film is Elizabeth. The first time that we see them, Elizabeth and Victor, as adults, they are exceedingly horny, which is so weird. This is maybe a personal issue. The novel, the relationship between Elizabeth and Victor is pretty chaste feeling. They do grow to love each other romantically, but the film, we get this horrifying scene where Helena Bonham Carter and Kenneth Branagh are breathily referring to each other as brother and sister, and it's pretty gross. I know that has really nothing to do with the actual adaptation. Is a purely personal choice. Not personal choice, but personal knee-jerk reaction to be grossed out by that. But it does feel pretty incestuous, and kind of glazes over how those kinds of marriages between adoptive family were much more, not regular, but they were something that happened, especially to keep money in the family, and to know that a partner was of quote-unquote good breeding. But in this, it just feels like they've wanted to bone for years, and that's so strange to me, given that they were raised as siblings. Later, I think Helena Bonham Carter, I mentioned this earlier, gives a really great performance. She very much gives a dimension to Elizabeth that isn't in the novel, where she is desperately trying to understand what Victor is going through, what his research is doing to him, and why it's pulling him from her. I think that that's a pretty nuanced performance. I think she might be my personal favorite performance of the whole film. The issue is then later, when she is revived. First off, her death is so brutal in the film. In the book, she's just, I think he just strangles her or breaks her neck. It's pretty quick. In the film, there is this extended makeout scene between her and Kenneth Branagh, and then he leaves for some reason, and Robert De Niro comes in, and she thinks it's going to be Victor, but no, it's the ugly monster, and he just shoves his hand into her chest and rips out her still beating heart. And it is very graphic, very over the top, in a way that's not needed to be, especially given the fact that this is one of the only times we get to see Elizabeth in a more sort of intimate and sexual position, and she's immediately murdered. In the novel, it's very much coded, and not even coded, it's strictly said outright by the monster that he is killing Elizabeth because she is the last person that Victor loves. Whereas in the film, that is what's happening. She is the last character to die in the film, that is in Victor's family. But with the coding of it being in such a intimate space, especially with the scene that then follows it, which I have the most issue with, and we'll talk about in a second, there is, I don't think it's on purpose, but there is an element of punishing her for Victor's sexuality and punishing her for the monster's sexuality, which again comes up in the scene following, which I think is unfortunate. I don't know if it's something that film production was going for, but it's definitely how it's read. Because then immediately after, she's revived. She's given this new intact body. And the scene where she is revived is very disturbing to me. She doesn't really speak. She kind of mumbles a little bit the men's names, or mainly Victor's name. And then the monster comes in and he basically tells her, "We are one and the same." And honestly, the only thing that they have in common other than being resurrected is that they have scars. And I'm going to come to the monster's appearance in a little bit, but he basically tells her that we are one and the same. He won't be able to love you the way that I can love you because I can understand what you're going through. And that is when, and she's torn. She's truly torn. But reducing her autonomy, because most of the film revolves around, not the film in its entirety, but her character revolves around her relationship with Victor and her trying to pull him out of his shell and understand him. And then now, the one time she truly has some sort of autonomy where she can choose, the choice is between one man or another. One man who murdered her for vengeance, and the other who very selfishly reanimated her with another woman's body. So that's not really autonomy, it's just choosing between one bad boyfriend and another. And then when she sees herself and realizes that she has lost her looks, she is an abomination, she's something that goes against God, instead of leaving and saying, "Nah, I'm not going to be with the guy who ripped my heart out, nor am I going to be with the guy who I loved, but did something against my will, i.e. bringing me back to life, that he should have known I would have been against," she instead self-immolates. And I think it's a really disturbing view of Elizabeth, that not only is she punished for both the monster and Victor's sexuality, she's punished for her own decision-making, and she's punished for the fact that she can make a decision. And it does feel very Rape of Lucretia to me, in that it would be better to be chaste and dead than a victim. But I hate it. I think it's very, one, it undermines a lot of the fault I think the two men have in this situation. Victor has already proven that his pride and hubris are going to lead him to really poor decision making. The monster only wants a companion to solve his own loneliness, not because he thinks someone else who is potentially seen as monstrous as well could find joy and love with him and shared experience with him. he just wants a woman specifically to fill a void for him. So neither of these men are at all thinking about Elizabeth. Elizabeth is constantly thinking about Victor and what he needs and how she can give of herself to get him to love her in the way that she wants, only for her to then have to turn around, make this really awful decision, and instead of making a decision, kills herself. I hate it. I think that it's really a disappointing choice, and that's why I'm spending the longest part of this sort of analysis on it. Yeah, I just think it's pretty gross. And then the ending. So first off, this isn't like a horrible departure, but I think there's a loss of poetics, maybe? I don't know if that's the right word for this. In the movie, the monster, Robbie De Niro, kills himself after Victor has died. In the book, Victor dies on the ship, and the men hear a cry from across the ice, and when they look out, they see this huge figure crying out and dying. And there's this sort of understanding or belief from the characters that their mutual hatred gave them this sort of malicious and tortured reason to go on. Victor fleeing the monster, and the monster, his entire purpose in life has been revenge and harming Victor. So with Victor being dead, he no longer has a point to life, and he dies. I think that to me says a lot more about the characters and this cycle of pride and anger and hatred that is what's pushing them forward, with the monster sort of choosing to die with his quote-unquote father figure. Again, it gives them this sort of moral decision. The men get to have these decisions, whereas Elizabeth did not. And I just, it's not the worst like adaptation choice. It just, to me, I think misses some really interesting ideas and concepts. It really misses the nuance that the book has. So kind of going back a little bit, Mary Shelley wrote this during a point in time where Romanticism was the reigning literary ideology. Her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, was a romantic. They were really good friends with Lord Byron, bisexual disaster, who was also a very well-known romantic poet. And a lot of their work focuses, the Romantics' work focuses on the divinity of man, how the Enlightenment gave man the ability to create anything. And Mary Shelley, like this novel very much is saying that untenured hubris will be our downfall. And I think that that's such an important part of the novel. That's why its subtitle is The Modern Prometheus. Frankenstein he's not a good guy, but he has this sort of goal, this lofty idea, and he shirks every other responsibility to get this idea, only for it to bite him in the ass. And I think this film misses that pretty much in its entirety. And that's why I think it's a bad adaptation. Now I'd like to move on to a rating scale. It's not really a scale. Some of these have numbers, some of these don't. My first question, this will be rated 1 through 10, is whether or not it adheres to the book's plot. I gave it a 9 out of 10, or maybe an 8.5 out of 10. It's, like I said, one of the closer adaptations to the book's plot. But again, there's some pretty big changes, and I don't think they're for the better. The characters from the book, I gave an 8 out of 10. They're all there. Again, deaths are changed. Relationships aren't changed, but they're tweaked a little bit. And those choices personally just irked me. I'm really just adding the romance element. I have no issue with romance being a larger part of this story. I think Elizabeth is a really interesting character who doesn't get enough attention, but I think the horniness and then the punishment of Elizabeth is pretty upsetting. Next, themes from the book. I have this as a 5 out of 10. I think they tried. I think that this film thinks it knows what Frankenstein is about, and I think that the film thinks that it got it right and that it is about a personal tragedy of a madman, or of a man driven to madness by hubris. But I do think that they totally miss the point, especially because they do focus a little bit more on Victor's personal tragedy and not how all of it was avoidable. And my last sort of rating question, oh, actually that's not true, this is my second to last rating question, is this film enjoyable? I gave it a 7 out of 10. It's a lot of fun to watch, especially in a group. The last time I watched it was with a group of friends, and we laughed through the entire thing. But I don't think it's very good. I think if you're watching it by yourself, it's pretty boring. The way I described it in my notes is it's a romp, quote unquote. And my last question, this does not have a number out of 10. It's just, would I recommend it? And the answer is no. I don't think it's a good horror movie. There's nothing really scary about it. Even the elements from the novel don't really stay with you in the same way that the plot and the characters should. I think it's kind of boring if you're not watching it with friends, which again, that's a personal taste issue, but still doesn't make for a great watch. So, no, unless you want to watch Kenneth Branagh playing from the age of like 16 to 25-year-old when he's definitely in his 30s, or you want to see wet Robbie De Niro, but I don't recommend this film. I'm sorry to anyone who enjoyed it. The first edition of Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, was published in London on January 1st of 1818. Mary Shelley was just 20 years old. The first edition of the genre-defining novel was published anonymously. Thank you so much for listening to the very first episode of Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein. To keep up with me, Sophie Marie, you can check out my website, which is dasbeastperformance.com. My Instagram is that as well. I want to give a shout out to my Patreon patrons who are the reason that I can do this. This is a side project for the love of Mary Shelley. So my $10 plus patrons are Jamari Littlejohn, Carrie Morrison, Lois Gallagher, Susie Wilhoft, and Joella Oldfield. This episode was written or scripted by me, Sophie Marie. It was scored and edited by Otto Schatz and distributed by Buzzsprout.com. Thank you very much.